I'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the second session of this year's Native People of the Americas Colloquium, which focuses on representing indigeneity in film. This colloquium is a part of the larger efforts by the University of Dayton to build connections and forge collaborations with Indigenous communities, as well as to foreground Native voices and perspectives on our campus. My name is Tom Morgan, and I'm the Director of Race and Ethnic Studies. Before we start today's session, I would like to thank co-chairs Dr. Shannon Toll and Dr. Teresa Segi for their work in helping put together this year's event, and to thank the sponsors of the Native People of the Americas Colloquium, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, the Multi-Ethnic Education and Engagement Center, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Race and Ethnic Studies Program, and the Department of English here at UD. We'd also like to thank Medicine Bow Forge. Most importantly, however, I would like to thank all of our presenters for this year's colloquium, specifically for the ongoing work they're doing to bring visibility, awareness, and change to the ongoing settler colonial violence that continues to impact Native communities and nations. A couple of housekeeping things before introducing our panelists. First, questions will run through the Q&A button at the bottom, so feel free to add your questions at any point you'd like during the talk. Second, if you are a student here for Path ABA credit, since this is a webinar, you will not see your own faces. Instead, at the end, I will distribute a QR link where you will respond to questions demonstrating what you learned from the session to receive credit. Third, we have 2 more sessions tomorrow. First, Paving the Way, Opening Pathways for Native Film with Joshua Nelson at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and Representing Indigeneity in Social Media with Brooke Thompson, Kanahus Manuel, and Aaron Wise at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Tonight's panel focuses on film as a medium for representing the issues facing Indigenous communities. Our 2 presenters are Floris White Bull of Hunkpapa Lakota and Cochiti Pueblo descent, who has been involved with I Stand, the Guardians of the Water from 2017, and Awake, a Dream from Standing Rock, also from 2017, both of which focused on the No Dabble protests regarding the Dakota Access Pipeline. Raised at Standing Rock, she graduated summa cum laude with degrees in engineering technology, or energy technology and Native American studies from Sitting Bull College, and is currently pursuing a degree in environmental science. Next is Jen Wickham, a Gidimt'en member of the Wet'suwet'en people and a producer of the upcoming film Yintah, which chronicles a decade of Wet'suwet'en struggle. Jen grew up in and around Wet'suwet'en territory, being displaced, but returning to the community with a dedication to learning and participating in the governance system since 2006. Her background is in writing and Indigenous research, with a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Victoria. I'd like to invite Floris White Bull to begin.
How Madaki api chante washte and ape choose api sto chante easily machi api Floris White Bull machi api yamasloha mataha. My name is Floris White Bull. I'm from the Standing Rock Nation, and really honored to be asked and included in this talk, and very honored. Thank you.
Did you have particular experiences about film that you'd like to share, Floris?
How I came about with my participation in both films was wasn't exactly planned. It was more of wanting to support the people that were coming to support us and their contributions, what they were wanting to contribute to the movement at the time. And I've had a few experiences that I've learned since the films. but I think a lot of it, when including Indigenous voices, that I think it should be important to include those voices at also in the aspects of editing, so that we can see how it's the message is being transmitted. Because as Indigenous people, we know what we hold as sacred. We know what we know our stories and what the messages that we're wanting to share. However, when journalists or filmmakers are coming in to share that spotlight, a lot of the times they come with their own biases, and they can filter our message through their eyes. So I think it's important to also be included in that aspect of editing, so that we can see what is being transmitted, and that to ensure that the message that we're wanting to convey is actually being sent out.
Floris, some of our students, many of us have discussed the No DAPL water protector movement in our classes, and it has been the topic of discussion in past Native People of the Americas colloquium. But we might have students who are in the Zoom right now who might be less familiar. Would you mind giving them some background on the importance of this water protector movement and the essential work that it continues to do right now?
Sure. The Dakota Access Pipeline was a pipeline that was originally intended to be routed through Bismarck, North Dakota, which is about 45 miles north of where I'm at right now. I'm on the Standing Rock Reservation right now, and because the people of Bismarck didn't want this pipeline to go under the river ahead of their water, for them to be downstream of possible pipe leaking, they rerouted it, and they rerouted it to less than a few miles ahead of our reservation where we're currently at. However, our original treaty boundaries are just on the edge of Mandan, below the Heart River, which is right on the edge of Mandan, North Dakota. And this pipeline is rerouted right through original treaty territory, and its rerouted placement has been an example of one of the many instances of environmental genocide, environmental racism, that a population of predominantly white citizens can successfully reroute a pipeline with no it wasn't a problem for them to be rerouted. And Dakota Access Pipeline had come to ask for permission to do that with the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and was denied, and they continued forward with it anyways. And not only did they continue with it, it was the first big action of militarized police on behalf of a corporation successfully launched for many states outside of North Dakota. Many states sent their police force to brutalize us as Indigenous people standing up against this pipeline, because it's an investment in fossil fuel industry, which really we shouldn't be making more investments in. The gathering of Indigenous people here in 2016 and 2017 was a historic gathering of over 300 Indigenous nations. Oh, tens of thousands of people came, and more showed their support. There was more religious gathering of different beliefs, different faiths, different races, all represented here at Standing Rock to voice their opposition with us and stand with us here at Standing Rock.
Floris, I was wondering, to the point about, the period when there are so many people who gathered in support of the resistance to the pipeline, many Indigenous nations, as you mentioned, over 300 different nations, as well as non-Indigenous peoples. I was interested in knowing a little bit more about how having, people from all these different backgrounds meaningfully served the resistance. I know there was a lot of sort of news treatment, about what was happening. And I'm thinking particularly toward, effective sort of partnerships with Indigenous communities on the part of non-Native people. If those, many people coming, if that was helpful to the resistance and having that, media attention, or if there's any way that, it wasn't as effective as maybe people who aim to be partners in the movement might have hoped for.
I believe it was historic at the very, very, very tip. It's probably one of the most educational experiences I've ever experienced in my life, because I got to learn from the people that came, each tribe. I got to understand their issues that they were fighting also. And because each tribe came with, because they understood the outcry, they understood our fears, not only just for the immediate, but for the future generations and for the things that we hold sacred. They understood because they're going through it. Each flag that was sent in support was because they're fighting their own fights too, and they took the time to come and stand with us and share that burden of the dismay, the hurt, the heartbrokenness, the fears of wanting to stop a train that's headed for a really dire future, and understanding that we all share that future. And it's just as much anybody's right that lives on the opposite side of the earth. They have a right to oppose this pipeline. They have a right to oppose unsustainable fishing practices. They have the right to oppose these things because it affects, we all live in a closed system. We all live in a world that's finite. The resources in this earth are finite, that aren't renewable, and it's just as much there. Every tribe, they understood exactly how we feel, and they were more than welcome. And I thank them, every tribe and every person that sent a prayer or a blanket or came and experienced what we did. It was welcome.
Could you speak a bit about the sort of ongoing no DAPL work you've been doing? I'm certain that some people are familiar with the sort of recent sort of court decisions and also that corporation's choice to sort of tend to ignore them. What type of work are you doing right now, or what can you sort of share about that?
Right now, I've decided to sort of shift my focus. During the struggle in 2016, 2017, I was still in college. I was still attending full time, and me and my family had a yurt set up with my family down in the camp. I would do my my homework on my laptop in my yurt and use my cell phone hotspot to send in my homework. And I just sort of continued it. I took a step back for a year and came back in 2018 and got my bachelor's degree in environmental science. And I am currently pursuing my master's degree in environmental science. My research that I've been doing was with traditional, medicinal, and edible plants along the Missouri that would be affected by a spill of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I've been wanting to continue the fight, but on different levels. That I feel that a lot of the decisions as far as environmental impact studies, that they don't take into account what we hold as valuable. When people look out on the land, they just see grass. They don't see the medicines. They don't see the wild, the growing food. They don't take into account how the access towards these has been shrunken to almost nothing with agriculture and human development, everything human development, that how that impact has had on our health as Indigenous people. And that ties in to today's struggle, where we have high diabetes and high blood pressure, poor diets. A lot of that has been forced on us because our lack of access to healthy food, and how today that translates with this virus, that we're higher risk, very high risk people, because we don't have access to the foods that our bodies have been adapted to.
Floris, if I could ask you a question about the film itself and your experience of being a part of it as a writer and as an advisor. You wrote, or the film includes this really powerful poem that you wrote called Awake. And I think I've got the title right. And I thought that I would take a moment to read it for our students to make sure that those of them who haven't seen the film, which it's available online, we have a copy of it that we can send you. The poem says, "I've been woken by the spirit inside that demanded I open my eyes and see the world around me, seeing that my children's future was in peril, seeing that my life couldn't wait and slumber anymore. See that I was honored to be among those who are awake. To be alive at this point in time is to see the rising of the Chedishakoan, to see the gathering of nations, and beyond that, the gathering of all races and all faiths. Will you wake up and dream with us? Will you join our dream? Will you join us?" I think mostly I wanted the students just to hear that poem and to inspire them to make sure that they check out the film. But I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit more about the experience itself of acting as an advisor and a writer on this film, and how you what choices were made, and how perhaps maybe people who were part of the film were able to contribute. And sorry, this is kind of a long question. And then also the film contains a lot of moments where there are confrontations, or mostly created by police and federal authorities, or almost exclusively created by police and federal authorities. And if you could talk about the kind of interference that they tried to run in the making of the film itself.
Well, like I said, a lot of it I didn't really entirely plan on. I didn't go in with an agenda going to camp to meet anybody that would put me in a film or anything like that. I actually met Josh Fox at a screening he was doing for one of his films that was with with Iowa, and they're wanting to stop the pipeline because it was going through Iowa too. And as far as like the participation and my role in it, and a lot of it was a spinoff of when I met with Josh. And well, I went down there with my partner at the time, and I spoke to the people there about what we had just experienced, and it was extreme violence, having multiple AR-15s pointed at my head, and the things I seen and the things I heard, and the really traumatizing event of the treaty camp that we had established on the easement of the pipeline had just taken place only days before, and had done an interview with Josh, which was then put on Now This, and got over 25 million views, and he came shortly after, and I let him camp in my camp. And a lot of what happened before then, with the dog attacks and the bulldozing of sacred sites that were here for tens of thousands of years, that you can't replace something like that. There's no, the loss to our people and our children and our future, with the bulldozing of that, which, people just are going about their days now, and they don't think about things like that and how detrimental something like that is to an entire race of people, an entire nation. Because we are a nation, we're not just a race included and lumped in with everybody else. Each indigenous tribe is a nation, and not just to be checked off with included as just all together as one. We all have our own stories and our own languages and our own histories, and that's included with respect to the land, our own stories that go with this land that we live on today in what is now the occupied nation of the United States. This place has its own stories that the indigenous people hold. They can tell you about the rivers. They can tell you stories of the rivers. They can tell you stories of the hills. They can tell you origin stories of the animals. And these aren't wild. It's not a wild place to us. Wild creatures, wild lands. It's our home, and those are our brothers and sisters, and they're as much affected, if not more, because they drink straight from these rivers. They eat straight from this land. And as far as the participation, I'll go back to, it happened at a very, very traumatic time, tumultuous time in my life, and a lot of heartbreak at the things that I experienced and the things that I had witnessed my own family and the people I love experience. And it was a really hard time for me, and just sort of felt like a washed up piece of something getting, dragged along in the waves up on the shoreline. That's how I was being asked to send in like voiceover clips, and I was in a serious depression because of the things that I experienced, because I'm so tied to this land and invested in my people. I love my people with every bit of DNA I have. I love this land and I love my people. And it's not even just us, because it makes it sound like if this pipeline explodes beneath the river, that only my people would be affected. It would be downstream. 17 million people live downstream from this pipeline. And it's not just us that we were fighting for. And a lot of hardship and hurt was behind. When I can't hardly watch the film because it just brings all of that back. I can hear the pain in my voice. I can see it. I can feel it. And I can still feel it today, all of it, because it's never healed. This company is allowed free reign. They can do whatever they want because they're billionaires. And people don't think that there's such a thing as collective consequence, that what they're doing isn't going to affect all of us, including them. And it's gonna. I know that's like not even entirely encompassing your questions you're answering, but I hope that answered most of them.
I think you answered questions that I think your answer surpasses any question that I asked of you. And I really want to say how much I appreciate what it means to share this right now. And I can see how difficult that is. And it's, I think, really valuable for us to understand that a film seems like a closed experience for many people, but to the people who have experienced this, it is an ongoing battle, and it's something that can have a lot of effects. And I really appreciate you, like I said, surpassing any question that I asked, and really extraordinary the work that you have done.
Why don't we shift to Jen Wickham now? I'm sure all of us have many more questions for Floris, but we can hear from Jen, then we can turn to questions as a whole.
Hari Sai Sozi Jennifer Wickham Sydney Gidimt'en is then Wet'suwet'en Hasley. My name's Jennifer Wickham, and I am a member of the Gidimt'en clan of the Wet'suwet'en people. First of all, I just want to say Sine Kelia to Floris. I don't know if she's still on. I really just feel everything that you just said. We are, a couple we're in the same fight, is what I'm very ineffectively trying to say. Also, Tom, I can only see your photo thing here. It's kind of throwing me off a little bit.
All good.
Okay. So for those of you, I know Tom said that there was on-campus viewing before of the film Invasion, and I completely agree with Floris. It's really, really difficult to watch footage of what's happening to your people. And there's this one scene in Invasion of my sister, Tsakase Slato, also known as Molly Wickham. She's the Gidimt'en camp spokesperson. And she's singing and she's being arrested. And I just can't. Every time I watch it, I just cry my eyes out. And it's really difficult. So we've done, or I've been a part of question and answer periods for Invasion a number of times. And I very rarely will watch it with the folks that are doing the screening, because afterwards they get me on camera and I'm all like red faced and like puffy eyed and I'm a mess. Oh my goodness, I didn't even finish my introduction. Sorry, I just felt so moved by everything Floris was saying. So I am the media coordinator for the Gidimt'en camp. And I am also a creative producer for the upcoming feature-length film Yintah, which is, as Tom said, documenting 10 years, about a decade of resistance in Wet'suwet'en territory. So I just want to make a note that decade of resistance has predominantly taken place in Unist'ot'en territory, which is my father clan, but I'm not an Unist'ot'en member. They are one of the house groups within that make up the Wet'suwet'en people. There's 13 separate house groups. And those 13 house groups are divided into clans. Gidimt'en clan is one of those 5 clans. And the house group that I belong to is called Kasiach, and we are neighbors to the Unist'ot'en. So the river, Wedzingwa, which is our sacred headwaters, is the boundary line in between Gidimt'en and Kasiach territory and Unist'ot'en. And I was actually doing my undergrad at the University of Victoria when I first visited Unist'ot'en territory in 2012. And at that time, there was a bitumen pipeline proposed to go from the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, to the coast. And it was proposed to go along this same route underneath Wedzingwa. And it was in 2012 that I met Wedzingwa and fell in love and decided that it was time to go home. I was doing a Bachelor of Arts degree with an English major, Indigenous Studies minor, with plans to pursue an education degree, which I did end up doing, but it took me a while because I had to come home and be with the river and be with my family and all of my amazing relatives up here. I totally relate with Floris when she says she came into this role sort of accidentally. So it's like the happiest accident of my life, to really take the training that I have through my Indigenous studies at the University of Victoria. I got to work with a really phenomenal documentary filmmaker, Christine Welsh. She's Métis, and she was working in the gender studies department and taught a lot of Indigenous courses, including Indigenous film. And so when we started in 2018, Unistoten got word that Coastal GasLink, which is a fracked gas pipeline, proposed pipeline, they had applied for and received a temporary injunction against Frida Hewson and her partner at the time, Smokelcam. And so they were the named defendants in this injunction. And when we got word that they were successful in obtaining this, and we knew that they were going to go in and try to enforce this injunction on our friends and our relatives, the Gidimt'en clan got together and decided that they would erect a checkpoint. Because we're neighbors and you have to go through Cassia territory to get to Unistoten, we blocked the road and put up a checkpoint in order to try and protect our friends at Unistoten, our father clan, our family members. And I had no idea what I was doing. My cousin and I were like, I don't know, like, do we do a Facebook page? Like, what is happening? And so we did all the things. We made a Facebook page, which has a really, really long name for anybody that follows it. It's kind of hilarious because we had no idea. Literally, me and my cousin were like, what we call it? And so it's like Wet'suwet'en access point on Gidimt'en territory. It's a mouthful. It's because we didn't know what else to do. And it was like, midnight or something. And we're like, we need to do something. So Gidimt'en camp has been in existence since December of 2018. Since then, I'm sure folks have seen the footage of the militarized raids that have happened at Gidimt'en checkpoint at 44 kilometer on the Maurice Forest Service Road past couple years. So they first came in 2019, and then they came in again this year in February. In January, all of our chiefs, all of our hereditary chiefs evicted Coastal GasLink. And it was pretty amazing. We had over a month of freedom on the Yintah, where there was no CGL workers and there was no RCMP. And it was so beautiful. There was no traffic. The moose started coming back. And I think of like in the pandemic when everything was shut down, like in March and April, and people are like, oh, the water is starting to be clear in the canals and wherever, and like all these things. And it's like, well, yeah, because humans keep messing things up. And if we just like leave it alone for a while, things can start to like be alive again. And so that was like a really, really beautiful time out on the Yintah. And of course, the RCMP came in again and arrested everybody and started destroying everything. And it was like during the pandemic, they just like ramped that up. They're like, oh, nobody's going to be around to stop us. So we're just going to do all the work we possibly can, even though we're not like permitted for all the things. And so there have been several folks, amazing videographers and documentary filmmakers like out there filming from the beginning. So there was somebody that came out like 10 years ago to Gidimt'en and, you know, took some footage, and I don't think ever planned on it being like a feature length film. They're like, oh, we'll just do this short doc about like this one summer out on the territory and like see what's going on. And then stuff just kept happening because first we were fighting the Enbridge pipeline, and then it was Pacific Trails pipeline, and now it's Coastal GasLink pipeline. And I think at one point there was 7 proposed pipelines that wanted to follow the same route to create an energy corridor. All of them wanting to travel underneath Witzinkwa, our sacred headwaters. And so they just kept filming, and people kept coming out, which we are so incredibly grateful for. And it was actually, I don't even know when I like officially came on board as a producer because time is really weird right now. And it has been throughout the whole pandemic. Like, I swear it is still March in my brain. Things are bizarre, but it's been a really, and even with Invasion, like the guys that worked on that are just phenomenal. They're very, very dear to my heart. And so they really wanted to make this feature-length film in collaboration with Wet'suwet'en people instead of making a documentary film about us. You know, they've been, and so when I say like I'm learning so much during the revolution, it's really crazy how much I'm learning through the revolution, because I'm like learning how to shoot, what's it called? When you take film from like high resolution and like make it into low resolution. I don't know what it's called, but I know how to do it. And I just learned that last week. And yeah, like this last winter, I learned how to use WeTransfer for the first time. And so I'm taking probably more of like a hands-on kind of approach, like than most producers might that are part of I don't even know what that means to be a producer, really, like in that world. I'm like, I know what I'm doing, but it's probably not the same as what other folks do. And so the guys that I'm working with are so they're so inclusive, and they're like, oh, Jen, there's like this thing, and do you know what that is? I'm like, no. And so they explain every little thing to me, even though it's in this like language that I don't even understand. They're speaking English, but it's a totally different language. And yeah, it's a really beautiful process, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. You know, as far as the media coordination for Gidimt'en camp, and I want to be clear that it's just for Gidimt'en camp. There are multiple clans within the Wet'suwet'en Nation that are active in land reclamation and asserting sovereignty. And so I am responsible for the Gidimt'en camp media coordination. So that doesn't mean that I do all the things, but I'm like, okay, we need to focus on this thing, and then we need to focus on this thing, and like keeping the flow and making sure that all the platforms are getting the same information, even though, you know, Twitter is a pain in the butt because they only let you show like a minute and something video clips. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. yeah, so I wrote myself a note. Hang on. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like I totally went off of track here. Yeah, it's a very collaborative approach. It's completely accidental, and I'm very excited to be a part of this process. We are definitely in the beginning stages of like actually producing a feature-length film, which is a huge undertaking, and we're all very excited, but also very, very first timers. So it'll be interesting. And we're doing it while we're still actively under threat and actively being invaded, and our territory is like actively being destroyed. So in the next couple of weeks, the company wants to, I wish I could see like a show of hands of people, like how many of y'all are following our Facebook page? You know what's going on.
I was about to ask you if you would share the Twitter handle with us, and maybe we can put it in our notes, and so that we can disseminate it to students as well, but so that people can follow your particular media outreach and the experience and the story as it develops.
Absolutely. Let's see. It's at Gidimt'en, Gidimt'en. And we also have an Instagram page, which is at Yintah, YINTAH _access, ACCESS. And then our Facebook page is the great big long one, Wet'suwet'en access point on Gidimt'en territory. Sorry, guys. I wonder if you can change that after the fact.
I think you can.
Yeah. I just thought of that.
I think you can, but I think you should keep some of that like really essential information so that people, people should get used to seeing that language. They should get used to being patient enough to look for it.
People have all the information in the title of our Facebook page.
They will know exactly where they are.
Yeah.
They're in the exact right spot. Jen, I was wondering if I could ask you to maybe explain to our students who might be a bit more familiar with United States relationships with Indigenous nations within what is currently the United States. But Canada's relationship is if you could explain that relationship a bit more between Canada and the treaty and the Indigenous people and nations in Canada. And also one of the great things about the film, I love the idea of how you take to task the notion of reconciliation and the weakness behind the government's work toward reconciliation, or just the lack of good faith reconciliation. And if you could let our students know a little bit more about that in that particular context that's at play here.
Right, absolutely. So first things first, reconciliation is dead. And I know a lot of people were like really offended by that and that sort of came out of the raids that happened this year. And so I'll go back to the first part of your question here. One of the major differences between what happened in so-called Canada as opposed to the so-called United States is that so this side of the Rocky Mountains, there were treaties made in Eastern Canada with nations there. And I'm sure folks are familiar with how treaties get broken. And so that happened, a bunch of broken treaties out east. But there were no treaties signed in what is now known as British Columbia. And so Wet'suwet'en territory is 22,000 square kilometers. You know what? Somebody always gives me like a US reference for like the size of that territory. I don't know the conversion.
We can look it up.
Anyways, it's a big chunk of land. And so the Wet'suwet'en have a traditional governance system that consists of a house chief for each of the 13 houses. Each of the 13 house groups has a house chief, and then that chief has like supporting chiefs or wing chiefs. And those chiefs get their direction and input from all of the house group members. And so the house chief, or like the head chief, if that helps you understand it, is like more of like a spokesperson. And so they're the ones who are responsible for taking care of all of their house group members. And so each of those names, so for my house group in Cassia, and Cassia means grizzly house. Was is our house chief. And so he is responsible for a number of different territories. And so he's responsible for everything that has to do with those territories. So like the animals and the water, like he has to know, have conservation strategies for like the moose population or the salmon population. And he's also responsible for the people that are living on those territories. And so, it's this huge responsibility, but that's why he has like supporting chiefs or wing chiefs that will help him do those things and that support him in the feast hall. And so the feast hall, which we call the Bathlats, is where it's like our government building. And so it's where all of our laws are made and all of big decisions are made and where our laws are enforced and where all of our business takes place. And so multiple times in the last 10 years, all 5 of our clans, all 5 of the house chiefs stood up in our Bathlats and banned all pipelines from our territories. So it doesn't matter if it's like an oil pipeline or a natural gas pipeline or whatever it is, they've banned all pipelines from our territories. And so because we have never ceded or surrendered our territory, we've never signed a treaty with the government, they have no legal rights to do anything on our territory. So they are actively invading sovereign territory. They are actively stealing resources. They are actively committing genocide against our people every single day. So every single day, the RCMP, who have no lawful reason to be on our territory and enforcing their laws, are harassing our people, my family, our supporters. They're interrupting ceremonies. They're interrupting our hunting season. They are, it's really, it would be funny if it wasn't so annoying and aggravating how they have this little script that they always say every time they are harassing us, that this is lawful and permitted work and you're impeding our work. And I'm like, well, actually, it's not lawful. It's not permitted because WAS hasn't approved you to do anything in his territory, and you're actually impeding our lives. So, yeah, sorry, I went off a little there, didn't I? What was the question?
You answered it. No, because I think that that's something really important for our students to understand, is that this is unceded territory, that there is not a relationship between these governments. And so that's why the film is aptly named Invasion, is that they are invading a space that they have no right to. And they're asserting sovereignty in a space to which they have no sovereignty. So no, actually, you met the energy I was hoping for, to be perfectly frank.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, I think, because most people are aware of treaties. And so like the majority of so-called Canada is treatied. Those treaties have been broken, so actually they're null and void, but that's another conversation. But in British Columbia, in Wet'suwet'en territory, we don't have a treaty. Like, this is Wet'suwet'en territory. And it's so frustrating when people just don't understand that. And we actually, I don't know if you want to throw a link up if you put a link out to the students. Some of it's hard to read, but for anyone that has like a legal mind and wants to look at a Supreme Court case in Canada, the Wet'suwet'en and the Gidimt'en people, so the Gidimt'en is one of like the neighboring tribes, took the government to court and actually won in the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997. And the decision clearly says that the Wet'suwet'en never gave up their title to the territory. And so since 1997, I believe the decision happened December 10th. And on December 11th, and this information came from like freedom of information request by a reporter that was like looking for any documents related to the Delgamuukw and Gisteway decision. That's a long word to spell. I'll send it to somebody. That the day after, so December 11th, the government, both federal and provincial, and the oil and gas industry formed a committee. So the three bodies, the day after the decision came down, formed a committee on how they were going to suppress the results of that court case so that they could still have free access to the resources on our territory, because they knew they were fucked. Like, this decision was very clear that the Wet'suwet'en had never given up the rights to their territory. And so anybody taking resources off of our territory were stealing them, essentially. And so I don't know what exactly that plan looked like that they came up with in 1997 in order to suppress the decision. But it worked, because nobody knows about it. Nobody's paying any attention to it. You know, it's how many years later, and we're still fighting for that decision to be recognized. And, you know, we've taken different approaches through the courts, through direct action, you know, appealing to the masses, and, you know, applying political pressure and all of the things. And we're still fighting the pipeline. I do want to reframe that a little bit, though, because I think it's really important also for folks to understand that this isn't, for me, this isn't a fight against industry. I'm not fighting against Coastal GasLink. I'm fighting for the river. And so I think that's a really important distinction for myself, because there's always going to be a threat. And so there's always going to be somebody or something that is going to threaten our headwaters. And I don't know, for those that haven't seen Invasion or don't know or haven't been following, like, we drink right out of the river. That the water is so pure and has absolutely everything that we need in it. You know, we feed it to our babies and we drink it ourselves. Like, at my house in town, I live in one of the neighboring towns. I go out there and fill up water jugs of Witzinkwa and like bring it back into town with me, because the water is just so good. And I feel so good when I'm drinking it. That town water is kind of gross. And that's what I'm fighting for, is like the right of my future grandchildren to be able to drink that water, and not die from fracked gas or oil.
So Jen, I was hoping to raise a question that I had offered to Floris earlier and sort of reframe it a little bit. So I wanted to, if Floris is still with us, to thank her for the insight she offered into how powerful it has been to have over 300 Indigenous nations come to resist the Dakota Access Pipeline and everything that has meant. But I also wanted to return, for either of you to the other piece of the question, which this is the reframing, to clarify that when I was asking about people coming in ways or media attention, that if there's ever anything that is not genuinely helpful to the effort, what I was trying to get at is thinking about people who are learning about these issues and, may really want to do something to help, to participate, to really work in solidarity with the Indigenous nations in ways that those nations define as in their interest, right? Like to how to do that work well. And part of why I was thinking about this is with No DAPL, that had, in the US context, an exceptional amount of media attention, generally speaking, and I'd be interested to hear how it is in Canada. In the United States, there's not a lot of sort of mainstream coverage of contemporary Indigenous issues. And so this was really an exception, but it also kind of raised that question for me, is all of that attention? I mean, I hope it's helping raise awareness and it's helping with the resistance, but I was, kind of curious to know if that is in fact the case. So I don't know if there's anything in there just in terms of thinking about how people can work in solidarity in a way that is truly helpful, even if they are not Indigenous people themselves.
That's a lot of questions.
I know, I think that's why I wasn't happy with how it all came out, because I was trying to pack so much into it.
You are. There's a couple of different things there. So I think one of the things that you're talking about is like what settler allies can do to support. And is it helpful to just like show up, right? Like how they did at Standing Rock. Is that, am I correct? Yeah. Okay. And then another thing is around the media and mainstream media and how that helps or doesn't in, exactly. the movement. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I almost dropped out of my teaching program and went down to Standing Rock when it was happening. And I was like, oh my God, like, I get it. I get that like intense urgency and the desire to just like drop everything and run. And I think that, I think Floris was saying like, that was really helpful. That was exactly what was needed in that moment for the nation. And I'm trying to think like, wow, what would that even look like out on our territory? Because it's like so remote. I think it would be cool. Anyone want to come to Canada? I think I think there are a lot of folks that, so because we are in the middle of the bush, like really in the bush, there's no cell service. There's there's a satellite Wi-Fi connection that is spotty at best. There's it's snowing now, in our territory, and so it gets as I'm sure, like there was snow in Standing Rock and really cold weather as well. But like during the raids this year, it was like minus 40. Again, I don't know the conversion. That's Celsius. It was really, really, really cold. And so, we get folks coming from the city that like really want to help. They're really moved to come and just show up. By the way, there's an application process on our website, yintahaccess.com. Click on the Come to Camp page. And we have to let people know, like, do you know how to chop firewood? Do you know how to cook? Or like all these things. Like, there's not, you know, I can't just go turn on the stove, or you know, you're going in an outhouse or in the bush, or anyway, there's a certain level, I think, of self-sufficiency, and also, you know, the isolation, especially now during a pandemic. I mean, folks were really isolated before. And so I think, like, your mental health has to be really intact. And so for folks that are wanting to do support from afar, I think that probably the most effective things that we've seen are solidarity actions. And so taking action where you stand. We've seen that happen in a bunch of different ways, from, you know, like when we saw shut down Canada earlier this year, people were shutting down railways and highways and trains and all kinds of things, but they were also like occupying government offices, government buildings. There was so much happening. People were going to like the headquarters of TransCanada, which is now TC Energy, who owns the Coastal GasLink pipeline. They were targeting investors, so they were occupying banks. There's a lot of things, and you know, there's like a list of subcontractors out there on the World Wide Web. And so people were like taking actions to tell them to, you know, stop participating in genocide. So there's a lot of direct action that folks can take. People were like shutting down the ferries on Vancouver Island in like the southern part of our province. And a lot of those things were happening that had a huge impact. And, you know, it was affecting the stock in the pipeline. It was affecting, you know, the different levels of government and how seriously they were taking Wet'suwet'en assertion and their lack of consent around this project. And it actually got the provincial and the federal government to come to the table to talk to the hereditary chiefs. And they have since signed a memorandum of understanding, which is a non-binding document that just says, we're going to talk about things. So I don't know if it's really obvious that I don't have much faith in that process. I definitely have more faith in like direct action, because that seems to be the only thing that like works. It's, you know, thousands of people showing up at Standing Rock worked, you know, like it got people's attention and it got the awareness that they needed to have their voice heard. And I think that that's one of the struggles. In Canada, mainstream media definitely took notice in February when all the direct action was happening and people were like, listen to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. And then people were like, suddenly phones ringing off the hook. It's like, we want to talk to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. And so that was really, really effective. It was still a struggle. So as the media coordinator, myself and some other folks put together like a media backgrounder, you know, kind of like a Wet'suwet'en 101, to send out with every single press release that went out. The press releases didn't always get picked up by like the major outlets. And if they did, they would often just quote industry's counter press release. So that was really frustrating. they would quite often get things mixed up in, I mean, I also understand that it's like, it's a lot to kind of take in, like our traditional governance system that's like thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. You know, it's kind of complex, and there's lots of different parts, moving parts that, you know, someone would have to really dedicate to some time to have a thorough understanding of how it works. And like, so I try to be patient with media. But I think one of the main sources of information has been social media, has been, we now have a YouTube channel, and our website, you know, because not everybody has Facebook. And so we're trying to get as much information. I think we just started a Mastodon page, which is like one of those like fringe, like alternatives to Facebook kind of things. I don't know much about it. I'm going to learn. Oh, and then there's also PeerTube, which is like an alternative to YouTube. Yeah. So there's all kinds of things. And so the reason that we have even started looking at these alternative platforms is because all of our moderators had their Facebook pages shut down. I want to say like a month ago. Again, time is weird. I think it was about a month ago, because there was an online rally that was set to target the two main investors of the pipeline. And so we were hosts to an online action that happened in, I want to say it was in June. And then there was another one set to happen again. And we weren't associated with it. I mean, we are associated with it, but like we didn't plan it. We didn't coordinate it. And so it was the 2 days before the second on. So the first one must have been like wildly successful for them to try so hard to get the second one shut down before it even happened. Because hundreds of people from, I think there was 14 organizations that all their moderators had their personal Facebooks deactivated. And so nobody could do anything on Facebook. So we wanted to like look at different platforms to be able to like get the information that we need out. And certainly, you know, like the feature film that we're working on right now is a pretty hefty endeavor. But I think that videos in general have been one of our main avenues of getting information out. And so we've been really, really blessed to have some amazing, what do you call them? Videographers on the ground. And, you know, like sometimes we're just shooting with our cell phones, interactions with police and whatever. But we've had some really amazing folks come out and follow us around with cameras and and then other folks that are editing the footage and putting it together into like a cohesive thing that we can then shoot out on social media or the YouTube channel or anything like that. So don't remember the question now. I'm rambling.
No, you hit it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Floris, you have your hand up. Do you want to add? Oh, she took her hand.
Hey, okay. So I had to move inside because it got really cold outside. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the point. I realized I hadn't said it. About the point with supporters and people coming in, and we did have the aspect of people coming in as far as meant to be people that would throw the movement off course, and we just always reiterated that we're peaceful and that we're unarmed, and trying to center prayer as the bigger objective, and that we wanted to remain peaceful, and that really helped. And as far as media, that's the biggest part. I don't think that we received, as you would say, bigger media coverage, because I know Lawrence O'Donnell came out, and Amy Goodman from Democracy Now!, a few like here and there, but it wasn't anything that was continuous or anything that really represented our view. And again, reiterating the things that we felt was important and necessary to inform the nation, the public, about our viewpoint from our point of view. And it's not entirely surprising, because media has been a tool, and it's been successfully used as a tool to justify the means of force, justify the means of using attack dogs and AR-15s on an old woman or on a child, or justify the means by first dehumanizing them. And that's what we had experienced as far as media. The only other regular update media was through Bismarck Tribune and KFYR, which are the local yokels here in North Dakota. And they were pretty much just using their position as a news source to justify, as opposed to utilizing journalism as a tool, and the privilege that journalism is supposed to be attached with. And that's to it's supposed to have honor, integrity in your reporting, and they had none. They just used their position to justify and to help further divide the people, and turning it into the white people against the brown people, the Bismarck and Mandan against Standing Rock. And that divide has always been there, but it became more apparent, and as opposed to being a news source, they just became another tool, which is right in line with what media has done. If you go back to the 1400s and you look at newspapers then, and they would talk about the savages attacking a village, or savages attacking an encampment, which would then justify the means of force in committing genocide. There's entire nations that no longer exist, no longer breathe. There's entire nations of people that the earth doesn't feel their feet. The this world doesn't hear their languages or their songs, and none of us know their history because they have been successfully wiped out through the use of media manipulation. And that's the importance of having media be a tool for us to be able to give voice to our own stories and to immortalize our stories and for the future, you know, and our viewpoints, because I know that I'm doing this with a good heart, and I know Jen and the people of Gidimt'en are doing that with a good heart. But you read the history books and you read the papers 100 years from now, and whose voices are going to be in those papers and in those documents. It will rarely be an Indigenous person. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
So as we're winding down, it's actually far later than I thought. Just a couple things. For those of the students who are out there, when I post the QR link, make sure you're signed in. Otherwise, you're not going to get any credit. I'd also like to ask our two sort of panelists today, Jen and Floris, if you want to send me links, I'll have the list of all the attendees. I'd be happy to provide, and I'm sure many of the attendees would be happy to get a list of sort of resources connected to sort of what you're doing to continue their education along the way. Would either of you like a sort of final couple of minutes to sort of like wrap things up for us? I'm not sure I want to jump into questions with just like a couple minutes left. That might not be the best sort of finishing sort of move we have.
I think, yeah, it's kind of an interesting, I mean, the topic for today is like how we're like utilizing film in the movement. And I'm really, it's a lot. It's really a lot to learn. I'd love to read some more of your poetry, Floris. I also write poetry, and so I find like having that creative mind already has been super helpful in just picking up new skills along the way and sort of like adapting and whatever the needs are in the moment. And I think that it's really challenging to be trying to like learn all these new skills and things while we are currently being invaded. And so if folks are, you know, this is a very current fight that's happening. So I think obviously all of your students are in the US and y'all are not allowed to come up here right now, right? Because of COVID. I think that's still a thing. I don't know if the border's open. So yeah, I would just encourage folks to keep an eye on our website at yintahaccess.com. There's all the links on there to all of our social media platforms, as well as contact forms. And we have an Amazon wish list. We have different needs in the wintertime than we do during the summer, so that's regularly updated. And please continue to watch what's going on out here on the Yintah and amplify as much as you can. If you feel so inspired, you know, taking action and making noise where you stand is always helpful as well. And I'll leave it at that. And I will send you some links, Tom, through email to send out. And it was really, really nice to meet you, Floris. Yeah, like I said, I had really wanted to go down there when I was in school, and everyone told me I wasn't allowed. I mean, my family and friends, because I was almost finished school. But I was doing everything I could from where I was standing. And yeah, I have so much respect for you and the work that you've done. So I just wanted to say Sine Kelia. And Nene Kelia to everybody that organized this panel discussion, and everybody that took the time out of their day to tune in and attend. And yeah, Aweta Masai.
Floris, would you?
Sure. Okay. So I'm kind of a little bit in as far as like what this film, what Awake has done, as far as given a global voice, or more broad voice to what had happened. It was only a sliver of time that had taken place here. And as a person that was, like I said, was coming from a very hard time in my life, and sorry, I'm a bit burned because things that had taken place between me and Josh. So there's like the thing where I'm like, I'm proud of the film, mostly proud of the film, but not so much because I've been burned by the by the person, and our values didn't align, and I feel exploited on a whole other level. And I had a hard time committing to actually speak because I don't want to entirely be known just for Awake, because I have my own voice. I have my own, the things that I need to say. But that's it, ultimately why I agreed, was because it is still a way for me to continue to talk to people, because it's still important, because there's still struggles being going on. And I'm honored and appreciative for everything that that the organizers here have brought me on to be able to speak to you people, because it gets to feeling like, as people, that our voice doesn't matter. And that's how it feels right now today in politics, that your voice doesn't matter. One person doesn't matter. And I remember the day one of Dakota Access Pipeline wanting to go out and begin construction. And I felt like I'm just a mom, as you can hear, obviously. But I'm just a mom, and I'm don't have money. I don't have billions of dollars. I don't have much, but I have my body, I have my voice. And I felt like if all I can do to stand up for my children, that yes, my children drink this water, and this is the same water that comes from this river that my child takes a bath in, that I cook our food, that you realize and take for granted how much water, something so simple and abundant in this earth, that you take it for granted, that it's something that you use to wipe your counters, you use to drink it, you use it, it's there for you when you're thirsty and you've been outside and it's 98 degrees and you're hot, and you want to cool down, and or you're a sweaty mess and you want to go take a shower, you want to wash your clothes, you see all these different ways that water's there for you. And I seen that, and I realized it felt like my water had an expiration date on it that morning. And I was paralyzed with fear for 2 weeks that we got the notice. And right now there's oil flowing under our river right now, today. And it's terrifying to think of every minute of every day and every second of every day. And I felt powerless in that moment before everything. And I felt like if I can just put my body there, I'll do that. Fine, that's what I'll do. I'll drive out there and I'll meet them. And that's what I did. And that's what we continued to do. And it just built and built and built. And you feel like your one voice is powerless until there's a whole bunch of one little yous out there putting your voice and your body out there. And heck yeah, I am down for direct action, you know, putting your body out there, because it feels like these comment periods are nothing more than a formality to companies and to the state now. And I'm about action, and I'll always be about action. And when it comes to our future and our rights as people, as human beings, because it's not all these titles, these different Canada, US, or state and state, you know, we're all human beings, and we should all be in this fight together to build something better, because what we're doing today, it's not working. And if you're scared because you think what's on the other side and wondering about this possible collapse, or people are in fear because they don't understand that there has been better. There has been better. Over 500 Indigenous governments that were respectful to your family, your time, your land, the animals, everything, you know, everything that Indigenous people were doing was self-governing in a way that was respectful to the land. And each Indigenous nation has a governance system, a way of governing and a way of living with the earth that doesn't require us to take from our future, because that's what we're doing basically. You think, well, these resources are just there, we can just burn them all. You know, you don't realize that what you're doing is taking from your own grandchildren, your own, you know, putting your own grandchildren in a place of hardship because you want something a little bit easier, and you don't want to face the discomfort of not wanting to try, you know. Indigenous people have ways that live that are better than what we're doing today, basically, is what I'm wanting to say. And thank you for your time and for listening to me. Thank you.
I'd like to thank both of our presenters today for, I think, very compelling and very sort of moving remarks. I'll go ahead and post a link for all of you students so you can go ahead and take care of that. So there's the link